We're going to start by using our aggregate demand, aggregate supply model to understand the Great Depression a little bit better. Why was it such a severe economic downturn? And just FYI, there's no actual technical definition of depression. Recession has a definition. Depression, I guess, just means it's a really, really bad recession. And so there were some factors happening that basically caused multiple negative demand, aggregate demand shocks. And that's what we're going to talk about first here. So, one of the things we need to know about the Great Depression is that obviously we've heard about the stock market crashing in 1929, and that is a shock to their confidence. People felt poorer and decreased their spending. And so you do have a decrease in consumption, which would count as a aggregate demand shock, a negative aggregate demand shock. This would be one that would normally recover on its own. In other words, normally aggregate demand would shift back on its own. But that wasn't the only bad piece of news that they had. So we were also having some problems with trust in the banking system. In 1930, from 1930 to 1932, there were 4 different waves of bank panics. And by 1933, more than 40% of all American banks had failed. Bank regulation was different then. The FDIC wasn't around. So this is just another reason that consumption was down. Okay, so that's our consumption negative shock. And then all of that also plays a role in how confident businesses feel, right? Not only are they seeing all this negativity, I guess you'd say, in the banking system, but they are having to experience all the consumers cutting back on their spending. And so just overall, not a very happy time. So businesses lose confidence and they cut back on their investment. All right, so altogether quite bad, but that does not explain why it was such a nasty recession, right? So there had to be something else going on as well. As we are learning, and will learn even more so in the future chapters, when the economy falls into downturns like this, we have various things we can do with government spending and money supply to impact the economy. And impacting it through the money supply is going to be called monetary policy. So nowadays, people would say in such a scenario that what we need to do is shift aggregate demand back to the right, clearly. And so we would want to do something that would increase the money supply. However, things were a little different back then because they weren't free to do that. They were running a gold standard type of money supply. So they had to protect the amount of papers they have to the gold. They had to keep that honest. They couldn't let that fall. So the long and the short of it was, in order to keep the gold standard running correctly, they had to decrease the money supply. And that is only going to make it worse, the drop in consumption, the drop in investment, right? So everything was kind of going against us for this. So we have both a aggregate demand shock from velocity, which is the consumption and investment, and we have an aggregate demand shock from the money supply. So that gives you some understanding about why it was such a bad recession that we actually call it a depression. Another thing that was going on is something called the Smoot-Hawley Tariff of 1930. We were reacting, and we weren't the only ones, but we were reacting to all this stuff going wrong by saying, well, we need to protect our economy. And this is usually offered as a classic example of why you shouldn't do that. So we're trying to raise taxes, or tariffs is what they're called, on imports, and then other countries retaliated. So really at that point, with the Smoot-Hawley Tariff mentioned here, I really could draw in a negative net export shock as well. I'm kind of running out of room. So we've, the components of aggregate demand, C, I, G, and X, we have C and I and NX all shrinking. So it's just a very bad thing. So it was the wrong time to cut the money supply. It was the wrong time to raise tariffs, but we did both of them. And so that helps us understand a little bit about what we should not do. Now, the economy was going to recover from all of this. So one of the things we've learned is these types of shocks, these aggregate demand shocks, will recover as the aggregate demand will increase once the nasty confidence blowing thing has passed. And we've learned that the money supply shocks will recover because our short run aggregate supply curve will adjust to a lower inflation rate. And so we would probably see in the recovery process a little bit of an increase in aggregate demand and a little bit of a decrease in the short run aggregate supply curve. And we needed those things to happen because growth rate had hit a negative 13% and inflation was a negative 10%. We were actually having 10% deflation. So we definitely needed the economy to do that sort of automatic adjustment process. The economy recovering on its own, no monetary policy, no fiscal policy, is going to do so through an automatic adjustment process. And that's usually seen as either the aggregate demand recovering on its own if it's a velocity shock, or the short run aggregate supply curve shifting to adjust to the new expectation in inflation. One last thing to say about the Great Depression is another reason we might live on in our memory as being such a horrible recession that we have to give it a new name, the Depression, and not just the Depression, but the Great Depression, is it was actually two recessions back to back. The economy was actually beginning to recover by 1936 using, the automatic adjustment process. The economy was starting to adjust to this, to the negative shocks and kind of work its way out. But then, in an attempt to fix things, government had actually raised taxes in 1936. And raising taxes is going to be a negative hit, a negative shock to aggregate demand. So we actually, if we look at the data today, we can actually see a recovery starting in 36, and then it just falls apart as the economy is hit with another negative aggregate demand shock. So a recession starts again in 1937-38. So what that really tells us is the Great Depression is two different recessions, essentially back to back.